And good morning. We are thrilled this morning to have with us in our office Representative Scott Perry, Congressman Scott Perry. Usually takes the moniker of Republican York County, I guess York, Dauphin, and Cumberland County.
York, Dauphin, and
Cumberland County.
Right.
But most importantly to our industry, Representative Perry is on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. So we're going to be talking a lot about transportation today, and maybe a few other things, depending on what you want to cover. As a member of the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee, he's going to talk about some of the things that that committee is actually doing and working on. But this whole conversation started with me going to him and saying, "Hey, we'd like to kind of get your read on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee's America's Transportation Infrastructure Act." And I think everybody that's been following our industry, our national associations, and other things are familiar with the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee put out a bill, reported a bill that would have a significant increase in funding for transportation. If you're a political junkie like me, you watch some of the debates, and there was one portion of the debate where somebody said, "I wrote the bill," and another portion of the debate, somebody said, "Well, I actually read the bill." And the interesting thing in the preparation here is Representative Perry actually read the Senate bill, and he's got a couple of things to challenge me on this, so it should be very interesting. So, and a lively conversation. I'll turn it over to you to just kind of
absolutely
give some overview, and then we'll get right into it.
Bob, first of all, thanks for the opportunity and for the forum. And second of all, look, as much as I might have some things to challenge you on regarding the Senate bill, at least there is a Senate bill, right? And we'll probably have a discussion about that because there's not a House bill right now. So, but at the outset, a couple things to be aware of. In the Senate, it's multi-jurisdictional. So this is just the highway portion in EPW, transit, rail, safety, and the big one, taxes and finance, how we pay for this those are other committees, right? And it's still got to get through those things. And one of the things I always kind of lament is we seem to me to get the cart before the horse. It's not, we don't have a problem figuring out the need. There are plenty of needs across the country regarding infrastructure spending. The question is how do we pay for it? It'd be great if we would start with that as opposed to end with that. But like I said, at least the Senate has a bill out. I'm very frustrated in the House, and I imagine some of your members are as well, because they want to see something happening. And
let me interrupt you for a second, because I forgot some housekeeping. So those of you who are participating on the call, if you want to participate by asking questions or engage in the conversation here, you can do that by using the Q&A feature located on the control bar, and then type in your question. I'll read it off, and it'll be very conversational. Right. So sorry to interrupt.
All right. So first of all, let's just talk in some broad terms about the Senate bill. I think it's about a $287 billion increase. It's a 5-year bill. About 27% increase in spending, which equates to, I think, about 20% coming down to the states. Also, I think a $5 billion commitment out of the general fund, which I think those are reasonable ideas. And I think they're doable ideas. There are some things that concern me. For instance, we're going to subsidize electric vehicle charging stations, and I just want to put you in the mind of, did we subsidize gas stations? And maybe that's not the worst of it, because electric vehicles are here, and they're very efficient. There's a lot of interest. They're very popular, and so on and so forth. But oftentimes they're heavier, and we're literally taking money out of the trust fund to subsidize these charging stations in this bill for vehicles that don't pay anything into the trust fund, right? So I find that particularly egregious and problematic.
Well, I think we have an agreement on that one. And I was telling you earlier, we have a bill in the state legislature that's somewhat bollocksed up because of that.
Right.
But the whole concept there is we don't really have a good mechanism now for those owners of those vehicles to pay their fair share of the transportation cost to maintain the highways. And as we look out into the future, it appears as though more and more manufacturers are investing in that. And what we're seeing here is not even so much the growth that will potentially be in passenger vehicles, but also commercial vehicles.
I think actually commercial vehicles, especially trucks, because of the shortage of manpower in that regard, the workforce, we'll see that. We'll see the truck the commercial fleet before the passenger fleet. But there's a couple other things in the bill. The revenues never reached the out. I think it's about an $80 billion shortfall over the 5 years based on the current formula, and it doesn't include transit right at all. Right now, this bill doesn't include transit at all, which that's only going to make that currently about $80 billion. That shortfall is much wider. So, look, it's hard to be critical because from our standpoint in the House, we don't even have a product, but they do. So, we're going to comment on it. Now let's talk about the House a little bit. I'm frustrated. We've been there in this session. It's now the beginning of October. So essentially this whole time, all these months, for all intents and purposes, we haven't had a hearing. We haven't had a substantive conversation. There's no product that I know of being worked on. There's nothing that we have seen. We have had all we have spent, in my opinion, and I think the facts, and if you look at the schedule, will bear this out, all of our time on 3 subjects, and I'm not short shrifting any of the 3, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Sure.
But those 3 are the effects of climate change and how transportation and infrastructure is involved in that, the MAX jet and the crash, and how the FAA is dealing with getting the jet back in responsibility, culpability, et cetera, and the Trump Hotel. And people might not realize this, but the Trump Hotel, the former post office in Washington, D.C., is on a 99-year lease, and it's a federal building. And so there's a lot of interest because it has the name Trump on it about, this is a $3 million a year annual loss for that property alone.
Right.
And now it's actually generating revenue in the terms of millions of dollars. But there's a lot of interest in who's coming, staying there, where the money's going, so on and so forth. And we just keep on focusing on that. Meanwhile, we could be working on a transportation reauthorization to companion with the Senate bill and work towards the middle to some kind of solution.
We had heard, I'm getting my timelines a little mixed up, maybe 6 months, a year ago, that Chairman DeFazio was actually working on some kind of a bill. Did that just that go by the wayside? Or
well, I'm not sure.
Your body language says, I don't know what you're talking about, or you haven't seen it, I guess is the better way to put it.
He might be working on it, but we haven't seen it. And quite honestly, transportation infrastructure, regardless of the differences between Democrats and Republicans, conservatives, liberals, libertarians, everybody in between, has been a bipartisan effort. Not to say that we agree on everything, because we don't.
Certainly.
But we all understand the responsibility and the need and the constitutionality of this in our districts. And so you kind of have your disagreements and your fights in committee. You figure them out. You get some things, you don't get some things, but you got to move forward. But you work together collaboratively. And so for members of the committee to not have really any awareness of a product being worked on is disappointing, because there's also a timeline with this. And I'm sure many of the viewers know this. Next year, we're going to have a presidential election coming up.
Right.
And the chances, just realistically, the chances of moving this bill, which includes funding, which is really, that's the issue we all want to discuss, right? Where's the money? How are we going to fund this? And so you're going to be asking people in Congress or presidential candidates to vote for some tax change, a tax increase of some sort, because the cost of things keeps going up and so on and so forth. It's just not politically realistic. The House should have had a bill out in April so that we could work with the Senate bill from the political timeline standpoint, and we don't have anything right now. And so even if we can get something out by the end of the year, the chances of getting something in this session are, quite honestly, just politically not realistic.
It seems like really the only thing that we ever get to is maybe the discussions on appropriations or the federal budget.
Right.
How does that all look for next year?
Now, the House has passed appropriations bill. I lament to say that they became very partisan.
Right.
And I'll just give you an example. It's not necessarily related to transportation and infrastructure, but the National Defense Authorization Act. Here again, for 6 or 7 decades, bipartisan, we have our disagreements, but the defense of the country is really important, and we all get it. So at the end of the day, after you have your arguments, discussions, what have you, you voted for the product because it was generally better than letting the enemy win.
Right.
So they moved a bipartisan product out of committee, and then in the rules package, they made it so partisan that it was a completely partisan vote on the floor. long story short, though, we passed our appropriations bills in the House. I voted against probably all of them or most of them because of the same kind of activity on every single one, in my opinion. But the Senate somehow didn't realize that September 30th was the end of the fiscal year was coming or whatever, right? So they didn't pass their appropriations bills. And so now we have a CR till right before Thanksgiving.
Okay.
Now, the T-HUD appropriations bill is out there, and there's an increase, but I think the feeling is that a lot of that money is going to be going to Alabama.
Okay.
And because Senator Shelby is making sure that that's going to be that way to pay for some things that have long been left languishing.
So in this process, we're not looking at any kind of a delay in existing highway or transportation.
No, I don't.
There was a worry about decision and that they would have to hold back from the Federal Highway Administration. We're not seeing that.
I'm not seeing that right now, but I just got to tell you, and I'm sure you sense this,
right,
with the current activities in Congress, and I say Congress, the House and the Senate, and of course I'm referring to impeachment, that has changed the dynamic of every single discussion. And so I don't think it would affect this because I think there are generally agreements in place, but anything can happen at this point, I think.
Yeah. So it is kind of unfortunate that we are focusing on some of these things that we're not moving forward on transportation or what have you.
Because even though impeachment is now, as I understand it, because let me just tell you this too, there's no set of rules, so to speak, for impeachment. There's nothing in the Constitution about it, so it's all based on precedent. But so this is kind of being made up as it goes, but there is also a new set of standards that don't follow precedent regarding impeachment. So currently, the main committees of jurisdiction for that are intelligence, oversight, and foreign affairs. But it is really literally taking up all the energy of everybody in the House, and that's what everybody's discussing, focused on, because that's what we're being questioned on. That's what and so there's just a limited amount of bandwidth and attention that members have for everything else.
It is interesting to see coverage in the media. All of a sudden, apparently there is no immigration issue anymore.
Right.
You mentioned the Boeing Max.
Yeah.
Obviously a very, very important issue, and that's kind of dropped off the face.
Everything has dropped. The president, they're starting negotiations with China again next week, and now, if you're the Chinese looking at what's happening in the American Congress, I think that puts them in the position of at least feeling emboldened in their position regarding trade. And of course, we're waiting for this U.S. Canada-Mexico agreement. Canada's elections are this month, and we're supposed to have it done before that. I'm not sure that any of that's going to happen, and that's unfortunately, it's really tragic when you look at the fact that this is a product that almost has universal approval from labor unions, from business, from the ag community, from industry in general, from citizens, and the bills, we have nothing on the schedule to see it's even going to come up.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about your district and some things that are going on there. And again, for those who are not familiar, it's kind of the York County. I guess you have a piece of Cumberland County.
We have, more than a piece. We have almost I would say almost half, maybe a little more than half of Cumberland County. Okay. But actually, the center of gravity for the district, the major portion of the district, is now Dauphin County. It used to be York. So we have essentially half of York from just south of the city north, and just west of Carlisle east, and all of Dauphin County. So that's the new district.
So let's just look at what's happening from a transportation standpoint in the district. You have Interstate 83, you have Interstate 81. I'm assuming a piece of that. You've got the whole Harrisburg Beltway system, like your Capital Beltway system, if you will, and a piece of the turnpike.
Pennsylvania Turnpike.
Do you have
Harrisburg International? We got Route 15
and the Rutherford train yard,
rail yards, and the Enola yards.
So your district is kind of a poster child for multimodalism, and
it really is. And businesses, industry, warehousing comes because of the confluence of those major transportation arteries and confluences, and also our relationship to a great portion of the Northeast, the Atlantic seaboard, and the population centers that are there.
So, in looking at the growth of the distribution economy that we're seeing
Yeah.
all up and down the 83 and 81 corridor. Is this something that's being talked about, in the in your House committee, or are you looking at?
Well, I know I'm personally looking at it, and
Right.
constituents, my bosses are looking at it. And, I commented to you earlier today, if you're driving on 81, 83, 581, which is the Beltway, and different exits and so on, it's Route 15 in peak demand time. So in the morning when you're driving to work or when you're coming home from work, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to be stopped in the middle of a highway somewhere, which is obviously, the inefficiency is obvious, but it's also a safety concern. And so when we look at this, this reauthorization, we're looking at expansion, not just maintenance of what we had, but expansion of what we need, because part of this, everybody wanting to come to central Pennsylvania, and Cumberland County is the fastest growing county in Pennsylvania.
Right.
The residents here are mired in this, in these transportation kind of, sitting in the queue in the middle of a highway because we don't have the lane miles. And so we need to address those things. But here again, we don't even have a bill started to work on it. I mean, part of it is, and I'm sure you're seeing it, we have a contractor here in central Pennsylvania that is way over budget and way over time on a project that's very important to people around the mid-state area here. And that contractor is also bidding other work at the same time delinquent on this project. And the transportation bill that we would work on in the House is an opportunity to put some language in there to fix that situation so it doesn't happen again. But here we don't have a bill yet.
Right. We have that problem. Of course, the whole, in addition, when you look at the time it takes to build a project out,
right.
Unfortunate situations like that aside, most construction goes off on time.
Right.
But our timeline is really
long.
It's really long, and that has to do with right-of-way acquisition,
Yes.
planning, environmental permitting, and streamlining. And I think that the administration has done some things on accelerating that.
And some of that is in this bill. I would say that's one of the highlights of the Senate bill is the executive order language regarding environmental permitting and so forth is in the Senate bill, and I would see that as a positive.
Right.
Because it codifies what the administration did in law, so it can't just be flipped over, and it removes that uncertainty for the future. And I would just say this too, Bob, oftentimes we complain about the overruns on time or money with a project, but we very rarely talk about when it went better than planned.
Right.
We really don't, right? So I just want to highlight, and I think you're probably aware of this, there's a major construction of a bridge on the turnpike locally here, and it went ahead of schedule. And I don't know whether they did this. I hope they did time-elapsed photography. They built the bridge right next to the bridge they were going to take out. They constructed it right there on the side, and then they brought in these huge cranes, took this bridge out, and set that bridge down ahead of schedule. And that's a great news story.
Right. The roll-on, roll-off bridges are very innovative, and
Yeah.
we're looking at those kind of things all the time. I will mention also, once again, for everybody, is that APC is working with the Consultants Association and with PennDOT and the Turnpike in looking at what our procurement process is and whether we have some opportunities, particularly on major projects, to use what is known as best value or design build construction that could help to accelerate some of those. The question is picking the right project. The one you referred to might have been a candidate for that. But we are looking at that as an industry, and I think it's important that we always try to be forward on that.
I think citizens, taxpayers, ratepayers, look, nobody likes paying taxes, and nobody wants to pay more in taxes, but they understand the value of a good roadway network and a good infrastructure network across the spectrum, and they're willing to pay for it as long as they know they're getting the value. And I would consider that project a good value based on what I saw, and time is important. If you saw what happened around this area when the turnpike was closed for that short period of time, it was devastating to traffic. So minimizing that disruption is important, and there's a value to that. And I think people are willing to pay for that as long as they see the value in it. And so the innovation that the private sector brings for the right project at the right place at the right time is valuable.
So we touched a little bit earlier on electric vehicles and sort of the move away. So we have a federal energy policy that dictates, I guess, if you will, less consumption of fossil fuels. We have a transportation or highway tax structure that is based on the consumption of fossil fuels. What do you think about the future looking at things like mileage-based fees or other types of funding sources outside the consumption of gasoline?
I think this is a conversation that we have to have as policymakers with our bosses, our constituents. And I think that we have been somewhat reluctant to do it because some things have happened over time that have soured the public's taste towards those things, which so let's talk about it a little bit. First of all, it's taxes, and people know that. And so they don't like it inherently. But the other issue now that gets put with the taxes is the privacy issue. And people are rightly concerned about their privacy. They don't necessarily, I think that, and in the conversations I have, people know that they have to pay their fair share to drive on the roads, but it's how that information is gleaned. And so if your car is going to record the mileage that you have every time you either plug in or go to the pump or whatever, I think people will be okay with that. They won't love it, but they'll be okay with that. But what I don't think they want is the federal government watching where they go when they travel 300 miles, where, and storing that information. And so I think that's their perception, that the federal government will, and they're informed by that by some of the things that have happened at the federal level with privacy and the breaches of privacy. Now, at the same time, I say that I do find it fascinating that they're unwilling to give that information to the federal government, which I agree with. I'm unwilling to as well. But they are willing to give it to private platforms. You can name a whole alphabet soup full of them that know every movement that they make.
Every time you go to open an app, for one reason or another, the question comes up, we would like to check your location. Is
exactly.
That okay?
What does that matter, what your location is, right? And so, but I think we have to be willing to have the conversation because, like you said, the revenue stream is going down and the usage stream is going up, and especially with alternative energy vehicles, whether they're electric or even propane or whatever, we have to make sure that they're paying into the system that we're all using and that it's fair.
One of the tests I think we're going to be able to see here in Pennsylvania is the Turnpike Commission is experimenting with an app, I guess, that you can put on your phone as opposed to having the transponder in your car. So
and I think and I talked to the commissioner about that just last month, and quite honestly, I think that the Turnpike is kind of ahead of everybody else, but it still seems overdue. But I think that's where we're all headed, and I think that there's going to be a fair amount of interest in that, as it should be. Again, but there's some peril with it if it's not rolled out correctly, and if it's not administered correctly regarding privacy, it imperils the whole conversation.
So one of the things that we're seeing in Pennsylvania is, of course, we have a huge amount of miles on our interstate highways, much more so than many other states. And for years, the conversation has been, if Congress won't find a funding source, how about letting us toll the interstates? And we do see some of the states doing a pilot project. I mentioned earlier that Virginia has some kind of a program on Interstate 81 that's really looking at tolling, I guess, commercial vehicles only, and then giving some local options there. PennDOT has recently come out and said we've got like a $2 billion a year shortfall just keeping the interstates up.
As it is now. Not as new capacity, just as it currently stands.
It's the existing, system. So is that a potential in the future?
I think it is, but here again, it's how you have the conversations. And I think generally speaking, people, and I think with some validity, say, well, I've already paid for that road once and now you want to charge me to be on it again. So I think, at least for the beginning of the conversation, we ought to talk about, first of all, allowing private and public partnerships. We've talked about this before at the, and there's a state level program for that, but not at the federal level, unfortunately. But if you're going to add a lane, instead of making it maybe like an HOV lane, we want the extra capacity, but make it an extra toll lane. And I think that could generate the revenue for people that will, and there will be people that will be willing to pay for it. But right now we don't have the we don't have the administrative process in place to allow that to happen. There are companies and there are citizens that absolutely want to participate in that. And I think, again, it might not create all the answers, but it's another part of the solution of many pieces that we ought to be discussing. And
again, I think one of the crucibles there, if you look at I keep going back to Virginia.
Right.
This is a whole different place than Virginia. Northern Virginia around D.C. has that system.
They call them hot lanes and so on and so forth.
And that was done under a P3 arrangement.
Right.
So again, an experiment there that we can look at that, and that may has some potential for areas like around Philadelphia because you've got a high population.
Yeah, absolutely.
In order to generate
and as you know, Bob, I mean, even though it might only have applications in some places, like you said, around Philadelphia, but what it does, if you can do that, it relieves PennDOT and the Turnpike or whoever else to expand the use of the limited funds they have for other things. So the net gain is for everybody, even though it might not be happening in your town. Other things can happen in your locality based on that.
You're very right, because as we look at the apportionment of money going out from PennDOT in various districts, the Philadelphia district has a high proportion. Yeah. And that's mainly because they're trying to rebuild I-95,
right,
which is essentially a 19-mile bridge.
Right.
And so if you were able to,
that seems to be a particular candidate to me for some of these things, but there's the politics of it as well, as you know.
Right. So we talked a lot about here today about some of the difficulties in Congress in getting things moving.
Yes.
So I guess a final comment or a final question from somebody online here is, what can we as an industry do to help kind of break the log jam, I guess, if you will, or since it, when we talk one-on-one with all members, they'll say, well, I'm all for it.
Right.
But collectively, it hasn't happened, and even kind of goes back before this whole Trump situation. So how can we be more effective in
these? Are hard, intractable things, regardless of the environment. They are inherently, and I would say this, and I tell some of my colleagues this: if you don't like the president, I get it. Continue to dislike him, but we have to get things done here.
Right.
And so, we didn't do things perfectly. And when we were in the majority in the Republican Party, I would acknowledge it. Nobody does, but we kept trying. I would say we kept trying. And I would just say that your membership needs to encourage the majority party, even though all this other stuff is going on. We have to run a country, and we're elected to govern, and we got to put some things either aside or compartmentalize them. It doesn't mean that you forget about those things over there, but we got to do this work over here too. And from my standpoint, the majority party has to know that we're willing to be in the discussion. We want to be in the discussion, but we're waiting on them to lead, and so we can't. So I would just encourage them. We'll be happy to come in with you and talk to the other members to make that happen. But I think they need to hear that message.
Well, I think working with our Keystone Coalition and our folks who from all modes of transportation, we're going to continue to take that message to Congress and also the state legislature as well.
Right.
So suggestion on some of the things that we can be doing to be
it doesn't mean we can't continue to disagree on other things and even some of this, but it does work better when you collaborate, as opposed to, even if the majority is working on a bill now, to just drop it at some point and say, here it is, take it or leave it. That's not going to be effective in the long haul, right? So if we're going to disagree and argue and fight, if you even want to call it that, let's do it now and get that out of the way, because we all understand that our districts need this attention, and history has shown that we will end up voting for something more than we will not vote for it, even if it's marginally better. Again,
thank you very much for coming in here today. Again, very lively, very quick half hour, I think,
goes fast.
My estimation.
Yeah.
But I think very insightful in a lot of ways, and we appreciate everybody tuning in.
Thank you.
They will have our members will be able to access this for a brief period of time. We leave the recording up.
And of course, our office is always open to questions. So if you do have a particular question on anything, please call.
I think when we sign off here, we'll give the contact information for your office up
great.
there as well. So again, Congressman Perry, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Bob.
Appreciate it very much.